The second death is a choice. Chapter 9. The second death is a choice. Chapter 9. Titled The Four Laws. Verse 1. Each of the three lives within us who are saved has a law. Therefore, there are not only three lives within us, but also three lives which belong to the three lives. I beg your pardon. Therefore, there are not only three lives within us, but also three laws which belong to the three lives, says Witness Lee. Witness Lee went on to say, besides this, there is the law of God outside of us. Therefore, within us and without us, there is altogether four laws. This is revealed to us in Romans 7 and 8. The central theme of Romans chapter 7 and 8 is law. Earlier in chapter 6, the apostle says, for sin shall not have dominion over you, for you are not under law, bracket of Moses. The only reason sin cannot have dominion over us is that we are not under the law of Moses. Therefore, in order to explain the statement that we are not under law, the apostle continues to speak law in chapter 7 and 8. Chapter 7 begins by saying, or are you ignorant, brethren, bracket, for I speak to men who know the law, that the law, bracket, of Moses had dominion over a man for so long time as he liveth. Again, but now we have been discharged from the law of Moses, having died to that wherein we were held. Later he says, I had not known sin except through the law of Moses. Verse 7. Again, for I delight in the law of God after the inward man. Verse 22. Finally he says, but I see a different law in my members, warring against the law of my mind, and bringing me into captivity under the law of sin which is in my members. And again, so then I of myself with the mind indeed serve the law of God, but with the flesh the law of sin. Then in chapter 8 he says, for the law of the Spirit of life in Christ Jesus made me free from the law of sin and death. In these words, the apostle speaks of all together about four different laws that are related to us personally. First is the law of God. That is the law of the Old Testament, law of Moses, which tells forth all God's requirements upon us, bracket, the Jews. Second, the law of the mind. This is on 7:23, which is in our mind, causes us to desire to do good. Therefore, it may also be called the law of good in our mind. Third, the law of sin in the members causes us to sin. Because the function of this law in us which causes us to sin is manifested in the members of our body. It is called the law of sin in the members. Fourth, the law of the Spirit of life causes us to live in the life of God. The spirit from which this law is derived is the Spirit of life, a mingled spirit composed of the Spirit of God, the life of God, and our human spirit. Therefore, it is called the law of the Spirit of life. Furthermore, since this spirit contains life, belongs to life, and is life, the law of the Spirit is called the law of life. Concerning the four laws, one is outside of us, the law of God, bracket, law of Moses, while the other three are inside of us, the law of good in the mind, the law of sin in the body, and the law of the Spirit of life in our spirit. The origin of each of the four laws differs. The law of God written on stone tables was given by God to men through Moses during the Old Testament times. The other three laws are derived from the three lives within three lives which we mentioned earlier. We know that with every life there is a law. Although a law may not always be derived from a life, nevertheless, a life always has a law. So if we have three different lives within us, we have three laws corresponding to the three different lives. The law of good in the mind is derived from the good created life which was obtained not at the time of salvation but at the time of the first birth. It's a natural endowment in God's creation, not a gift in God's salvation. Before we were saved, there was frequently in our mind and thoughts a natural inclination to desire to do good, to honor our parents, to be benevolent to men, or to be remorseful, hoping to reform ourselves and determining to go upwards. These thoughts of doing good and going upwards are derived from the law of good in our mind. They also prove that even before we were saved, they also prove that even before we were saved, this law of good was already within us. Some people based on Romans 7:18, for I know that in me dwelleth no good thing, conclude that either before we were saved or after we are saved, there is no good thing within us. Therefore, the law of good which is in our mind cannot be derived from our original created life, which created life much less exists before we were saved. However, if we read Romans 7:18 carefully, we will see that this conclusion is inaccurate. For when Paul says there is no good thing within us, he is referring to the condition in our flesh. And the flesh spoken of here, according to the context of verses 21, 23, and 24, refers to our fallen, transmuted body. In our fallen, transmuted body, that is in our flesh, there dwells no good thing. This does not mean that there is no good thing at all in us fallen beings. On the contrary, we are told clearly later in the chapter that within us fallen beings there is will, which desires to do good, and a law of good in our mind. Both the will and the mind are parts of our soul. Therefore, although there is no good thing in our fallen and transmuted body, there is an element of goodness in both the mind and the will of our soul, even after the fall. This element of goodness naturally belongs to our original created life. Therefore, the law of good in our mind is of our original created life and existed before we were saved, even at our first birth. Some may say that our good created life, having been corrupted by Satan through the fall, has lost its element of goodness. This is also inaccurate. For example, adding a sour element into a glass of honey water damages the sweet taste, but does not eliminate the sweet element. Although man has been damaged by Satan, his element of goodness still remains. It is a fact that the element of goodness created in man has been corrupted by Satan and has thus become incurable. But we cannot say that it has been corrupted to the point of non-existence. If you smash a glass, it will disintegrate into pieces, but its element still remains. A piece of gold bar may be thrown into a filthy pool, but the element of gold still exists. Although our honor to parents, brotherly love, loyalty, sincerity, propriety, morality, modesty, and sense of shame are rather impure and mixed, yet these elements are genuine. Therefore, we can conclude that although our goods elements have been defiled, they still remain after the destruction. Though they are very weak, still they remain. It is for this reason that the Chinese sages and philosophers have discovered that within man there are some illustrious virtues, an innate consciousness, etc., and have concluded that the nature of man is good. The discovery of these philosophers concerning human nature is indeed right, because within us fallen beings there is still the element of goodness and the law which naturally causes us to desire to do good. The law of sin in the members is derived from the fallen and evil life of Satan. We have said before that due to Adam's fall through sinning, eating the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, Satan's life entered into man. Within this law, this life of Satan, there is contained a law of evil, that is the law of sin in the members. Since the life of Satan is evil, the law which is derived from this life naturally causes man to sin and do evil. The law of the spirit of life derived from the spirit of life which is in our spirit and from uncreated divine life of God. When we received the Lord and were saved, the Spirit of God together with the life of God entered into our spirit and mingled with our spirit to become the spirit of life. In this life of the spirit of life, there is contained a law, which is the law of the spirit of life, or the law of life. Therefore, we must see clearly that when we are saved, God did not put the law of good in us. Rather, he put the law of life in us. God's purpose in us is life, not goodness. When God saves us, He puts the law of life in us. The law of good is not given through God's salvation, but through His own creation. The element of good, of doing good, that is in us is inherent. But when God saves us, He puts His life in us. In this life, there is contained a law of life, the law of the Spirit of life. This law is obtained at the time of our salvation and is derived from God's salvation of life. Therefore, concerning the origin of these four laws, we can say that the law of God derived from God is of God. The law of good in the mind derived from the life of man is of man. The law of sin in the members derived from Satan's life is of Satan. And the law of the Spirit of life derived from the Spirit of life is of the Spirit. In order to have a precise knowledge of the four laws, we must be clear about their receptive locations. The law of God, bracket law of Moses, was written on tables of stone. Hence, it is outside of us. The law of good is in our mind, that is in our soul. Since the life of doing good is in our soul, the law which is derived from this life is also, of course, in our soul. The function of this law is especially manifested in the mind of our soul. Hence, it is called of the mind. Hence, this law is called of the mind. Therefore, in our soul, we have the life of man, the law of good which is derived from such a life, and the good human nature. The law of sin is in our members, that is in our body. During man's fall, he took the fruit of the tree of knowledge into his body. Hence, the evil life of Satan entered into our human body. Thus, the law of sin derived from the life of Satan is also in our body. Since this law is in our body, and the body is composed of the members. This law is in our members. Thus, in our body, we have Satan, the life of Satan, the law of sin, which is derived from the life of Satan and the evil nature of Satan. Due to the fact that Satan and his evil things entered into our body and mixed with it, it was transmuted and became the corrupted flesh. The law of the Spirit of life is in our spirit. Since the Spirit of life together with the life of God dwells in our spirit, the law derived from the Spirit of life is also in our spirit. This law is derived from the Spirit of God and is in our spirit. Therefore, not only is its origin spirit, but its location is spirit. Hence, it is entirely of the Spirit. It is neither of the body nor of the soul. Thus, in our spirit, we have God, the life of God, the law derived from the Spirit of God's life and His nature of life. What are the nature and functions of these four laws outside and inside of us? The law of God, bracket Moses, is composed of the statutes of God, and its nature is holy, righteous, and good. This law, being outside of us, enables us to know what God condemns and what He justifies. It requires us to reject what God condemns and do what He justifies in order to comply with God's holy, righteous, and good statutes. The law of good in our mind, derived from our created human life of good, contains the good human nature and exactly fits the nature of the law of God outside of us. This law creates in us, that is in our mind, the desire to do good, especially when the law of God outside of us requires us to be good. This law of good in us gives us the inclination toward doing good. Therefore, the mind in us delights in obeying the law of God outside of us. This is what the apostle says, I of myself with the mind indeed serve the law of God. The law of sin in our members, derived from the evil and fallen life of Satan in our flesh, contains the evil nature of Satan. The evil life of Satan is the evil that is present in our flesh and the sin that dwells within us. The law that comes out of this evil life causes us to sin because it's a law of sin. This law displays from our flesh its natural power to do evil and wars against the law of good in our mind. When the law of good in our mind gives us the desire to do good, this law of sin rises to war against it and brings us into captivity to sin and death. Romans 7:23. Hence, not only are we unable to fulfill our desire to do good or to satisfy the good requirement of God's law. On the contrary, we obey the law of sin in our members, committing all kinds of sin and obtaining death, just as described in Romans 7:21-24. Therefore, we sin not of our own choice, nor of our own volition. Rather, it is the law of sin which motivates us from within. Hence, we can see here that within us fallen beings, there are two contradicting laws. One is derived from the created life of good and works in the mind of our soul, giving us the desire to do good. The other is derived from the fallen evil life of Satan and works in the members of our body, causing us to commit sin. These two opposite laws, doing contradictory works in our mind and in our members, war against one another within us. The result is that the law of sin usually overcomes the law of good. Hence, we fail to do good, which we desire, and are forced to do evil, which we do not want to do. This is what the Chinese call the war between reason and lust. Reason is the element of doing good inherent in our created life. Lust is the sin that dwells in our fallen body, or the evil that is in our flesh. Although reason is partly derived from our human conscience, it works in our mind. Hence, the goodness resulting from the outworking of reason is either derived from or passes through the intellect. Although lust is related to our fallen human nature, it works in the members of our body. Hence, the evil which is the outworking of lusts is derived from lust. For this reason, one who is strong in intellect is more capable of doing good, while one who is more passionately For this reason, one who is strong in intellect is more capable of doing good, while one who is more passionate easily does evil. In other words, all the good done by men either originates from or passes through the intellect in the mind, whereas all the evil done by men is the outworking of the lusts in the members. When the reason in our mind gains the position of advantage, it causes man to do good. When the lust in the members gains the superior position, it causes man to do evil. Some people think that this kind of war is the same as the strife mentioned in Galatians 5. This is not accurate. Galatians 5 speaks about our flesh striving against the spirit. This occurs only after we are saved and have obtained the Holy Spirit. But the war between the two laws is related to the war between the fallen evil life of Satan and the created life of good. And this war exists even before we are saved. Therefore, this is an inner war existing before we are saved. It is also a war between good and evil existing in all worldly people. This sin, out from which came law of sin, is the life of Satan, and is therefore alive. Sin shown as capitalized signifies that it is personified and is unique. In the universe, there is only one God, and there is only one sin. Sin is a special term and a unique object. Sin is another name of Satan. Therefore, Romans 5:8 tells us that sin can reign over us, have dominion over us, cause us to be his slave in opposition to God, dwell in us, and overpower us, causing us to do the evil which we would not. The many sins outside of us are but the actions resulting from the working of the unique sin within us. This unique sin is the root and mother of all sins. How does sin cause us to sin outwardly? We have seen that sin dwells in our body. However, it is the will, not the body, that is the motivating organ. The will, which belongs to the human soul, being controlled by sin and obeying the orders of sin, instigates the human body to commit sin. Hence, although sin dwells in our body, its damaging work advances from the circumference to the center. With the body as the base, it projects forth poison of sin, causing damage to our soul and spirit until our whole being is corrupted. Therefore, Jeremiah 17 says, the heart is deceitful above all things. Romans 1 and Mark 7 also declare that there are all kinds of sins within man. These scriptures prove that man is completely corrupted by sin within and is full of sins. Hence, in the soul of man today, his mind is evil, his emotion is defiled, his will is rebellious, and even his spirit is darkened. These are the results of the work of sin in man. But we must thank the Lord, for in us who are saved, there are not only the two laws of good and evil of man and of Satan, there is also the law of the Spirit of God's life. 46. Since this law is derived from the Spirit of God's life, it comes from the uncreated divine life of God. As far as the nature of being both divine and eternal is concerned, of all the so-called lives in the universe, only the life of God is life. Therefore, the nature of God's life is life. Since the law of the Spirit of life derived from the life of God, its nature is life. Just as the nature of the life of God is life. It is not like the two previously mentioned laws, which are either good or evil, because of the life from which they are derived. According to scriptural revelation, life and good are different. Here we have three main points. First, life is nature of the life of God, whereas good is the nature of the life of man. Second, life is good, but good is not necessarily life. Third, the tree of life and the tree of good and evil in the Garden of Eden shows us that life and good are definitely different. Life is neither good nor evil. Life, good and evil are three different and independent things. We should realize not only that life and good are not the same, but that life differs from good. There is the good of God and there is also the good of man. God's good comes from the life of God and contains the nature of God's life. Man's good comes from the life of man and contains only man's good nature. The good mentioned in Ephesians 2:10 and 2 Timothy 2:21 is the good which we live out through the life of God's good. The good mentioned in Matthew 12:35, Romans 7:18, 19:21, 9:11 is the good which we live out according to our own life. Hence, it is the good derived from the life of man and is the good of man. The good derived from the life of man is but the good of man without the nature, life, or the element of God. Only the good of God derived from the life of God is not only good, but only possesses the nature of life and God's very element. Therefore, when we say that life and good are different, we mean that the life of God and the good of man are different. The good of man derived from the life of man and containing nothing of the life nature of God naturally differs from the life of God. However, since God's good is derived from the life of God and contains the life nature of God, we cannot say that it differs from the life of God. Thus, we see that the law of the Spirit of life containing the life nature of God can cause us to live out the life of God, that is, to live out the good of God. Moreover, these three different laws within us also in their degree of strength. We know that laws vary in strength according to the degree of strength of the objects of their respective origins. The law of good is derived from the life of man, and the life of man is the weakest. Hence, the strength to do good of the law of good is also the weakest. The law of sin derived from the stronger life of Satan. Hence, this law's power of sinning is stronger than the power of doing good of the law of good. It not only disables us from doing good, but it causes us to commit sin and do evil. The law of the Spirit of life is derived from the strongest life, the life of God. Hence, the power of this law is also the strongest. It not only keeps us from obeying the law of sin to commit sin, but also enables us to obey itself and live out the life of God naturally. Philosophers throughout generations have advocated various ways of cultivating morality or improving behavior. In fact, what they have advocated is working through human intellect, self-will, and self-effort on the already corrupted body and soul in order to restore or reactivate the original good in man. All this cannot overcome the natural power of the law of sin and death. The strength of man is limited, while the power of the law of Moses is enduring. Man's striving is a self-assertion, while the power of law of Moses is spontaneous. Man, by using his own effort, may be able to sustain himself for a while, but once his strength is exhausted, exhausted the power of the law of Moses manifests itself again. Therefore, God's way of deliverance is not to work on our outward body by dealing with the sin which surrounds us, not to work on the soul, which is between our body and our spirit, by strengthening our will to do good. But it is in our center, that is in our spirit, that God adds into us a new element, which brings with it a mighty power of life. Then he advances from our center to the circumference, penetrating through all the parts of our being, using one law to subdue another law, to overcome the power of sin in the law of sin. Moreover, we are enabled to live out the good required by the law of God, which we were unable to live out formerly through the law of good. And much more, through the life which is derived from the law of spirit of life, we are able to live out the life which God desires. Therefore, the Bible shows us that there are 4 laws related to us, 1 outside of us and 3 inside of us. The one outside us is the law of God, bracket, law of Moses. Of the 3 that are inside us, 1 is on our soul, 1 in our body, and 1 in our spirit. The law in our soul, derived from the created good human life, is good and gives us desire to do good. The law in our body, derived from the fallen evil life of Satan, is evil and causes us to sin. The law in our spirit, derived from the uncreated divine life of God, is divine and causes us to live out the divine life of God. The law of God outside of us represents God giving us the requirements of holiness, righteousness, and goodness. The law of good in our soul, upon touching the holy and good, requires of the law of God, desires and determines to fulfill the requirements. But the law of sin in our members, when it realizes that the law of good in our soul desires to fulfill the holy and good requirements of the law of God outside of us, will surely oppose, resist, and usually overcome the law of good in our soul. Thus, we are not only disabled from fulfilling God's law, but instead we violate the holy and good requirements of the law of God outside of us. This is because the law of sin in our body is stronger than the law of good in our mind, the law of good in our soul. However, the law of spirit of life in our spirit is even stronger than the law of good in our soul. Therefore, if we turn to our spirit and live according to our spirit, the law of the spirit of life in our spirit will deliver us from the law of sin in our body and cause us to live out the divine life of God. Thus, not only will we be able to fulfill the holy and good requirements of God, but we can meet the divine standard of God himself. For example, the outward law of God requires us not to be covetous. The law of good in our soul, upon touching this requirement of God's law, desires to fulfill it and determines not to be covetous anymore. But at this time, the law of sin in our body immediately rises in opposition, causing us to be inwardly covetous. Thus, we are unable to fulfill the law of God, which requires us not to be covetous. At this time, however much we will and determine, we cannot rid ourselves of a covetous heart. On the contrary, the more we will and strive to rid ourselves of covetousness, the more it grows within us. Whenever, due to the outward requirement of God's law, the law of good in our soul desires to do good, the law of sin in our body would immediately cause evil to work in us and war against our thought of good. Furthermore, the law of good in our soul is no match for the law of sin in our body. In almost every encounter, it loses to the law of sin in our body. But praise the Lord, the law of spirit of life in our spirit is stronger than the law of sin in our body.